She claimed me right there, against the cold, unyielding mahogany of the rare archives, in a moment where the weight of centuries-old secrets seemed to press down on us, and I will never forget the predatory hunger in her eyes that made me realize I was no longer just her little brother's best friend. Crossing the line with Olivia meant more than just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a total declaration of war against my loyalty to Leo, a brotherhood that had survived everything until this very midnight. If we were discovered, my academic future would be incinerated in an instant, but the look she gave me suggested that the real danger wasn't being caught. It was the fact that I didn't want to leave the shadows. The university library at midnight is a cathedral of ghosts, a labyrinth of towering shelves where the air is thick with the scent of dust, the vanilla-like decay of old paper, and the suffocating stillness of a world that has stopped breathing. I was buried deep in the restricted section, Section 4B, trying to drown my anxiety in a thesis on existentialism, but the silence was too loud, vibrating with the electric hum of the overhead lights that flickered like a dying pulse. Then, I heard the soft, deliberate click of heels against the marble floor, a sound that shouldn't have been there, a rhythm that was too confident for a wandering student. I looked up, and there she was, Olivia, stepping out from the shadows of the theology aisle, her hair pulled back in that familiar, severe librarian's bun, but her eyes were burning with a fire that made the cold air in the room suddenly feel like a furnace. She didn't say a word at first. She just watched me, her gaze tracing the line of my jaw with a terrifying, possessive intensity that made my heart hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. She moved toward me with a fluid, feline grace, her presence obliterating the distance between us until the scent of her expensive, dark cherry perfume replaced the musty smell of the books. When she finally reached out, her fingers were cool against my neck, but the heat where her skin touched mine was a scorching revelation that shattered the last of my focus. She pushed me back, my spine hitting the hard edges of the encyclopedias with a dull thud that echoed through the empty hall, and for a second, I thought she was going to scold me for being there past hours. Instead, she leaned in, her breath ghosting over my lips, and I felt the world outside the library vanish into a blur of ink and shadow. "Alex," she whispered, her voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to travel straight through my skin and into my marrow. "You've been coming here every night for a month, pretending to study. Did you think I wouldn't notice the way you watch me through the security monitors?" The shame was a bitter pill, but the desire was a tidal wave, and as her hand slid from my neck to the collar of my shirt, I realized the rule of silence wasn't there to protect the books. It was there to hide the things that happened when the lights went low. The tension between us was no longer a hidden current. It was a physical force, a rhythmic pressure that turned the clinical atmosphere of the archives into something primal and dangerous. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic beam of light cut through the darkness of the main hall, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of Mr. Henderson's security boots. The old guard was making his final rounds, the static of his radio hissing like a warning from a world I was about to betray. The light danced across the leather spines of the books, inches away from our hiding spot, and I felt a cold jolt of terror seize my lungs. If he turned the corner, he'd see the university's most respected librarian pitting a student against the shelves in a way that defied every moral code we were supposed to uphold. Olivia didn't flinch. She simply pressed her body closer to mine, her heart beating a frantic, matching tempo against my chest, her eyes locking onto mine with a silent, daring challenge. We were suspended in a moment of absolute risk, the external world threatening to shatter our secret before it had even fully begun, and yet, the proximity of her skin made the danger feel like a necessary fuel for the fire she had ignited. I could feel the silk of her blouse against my palms, a texture that felt like forbidden fruit, and the heat radiating from her was the only thing that kept the icy grip of panic from winning. We held our breath, two silhouettes merging into one amidst the archives, as the flashlight beam lingered on our row for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. Henderson's footsteps eventually faded into the distance, the heavy doors of the main section groaning shut, but the silence that followed was even more dangerous than his presence. Olivia pulled back just an inch, her hand reaching into the pocket of her blazer and producing a heavy, ornate iron key, the key to the inner gate of the rare books vault, a place where no cameras could reach and no guards ever ventured. She didn't ask me to follow her. She simply walked toward the iron-barred gate that separated the archives from the vault, the metallic chime of the key against the lock sounding like a final, irrevocable sentence. She turned the key, the heavy gate creaking open with a sound of ancient metal, and then she looked back over her shoulder, a predatory smile playing on her lips. "The archives are closed, Alex," she said, her voice dropping to a husky, intimate register that made my blood boil. "But the vault is just opening. You can leave now and pretend this never happened, or you can step into the dark and find out why silence is the only rule I truly care about." She stepped through the gate and left it ajar, a ticket into a world of shadows that I knew I wouldn't be able to refuse, even if it meant losing everything I had ever known. The heavy iron gate of the rare books vault groaned shut behind us, the sound of final and irrevocable punctuation to the world I had left behind in the main archives. Inside, the atmosphere was thick and ancient, the air chilled to a precise temperature to preserve the crumbling vellum and leather of centuries past. But against the cold stone walls, the heat radiating from Olivia was a scorching, localized sun. The vault was a sanctuary of shadows, illuminated only by the faint, ethereal glow of the security monitors in the corner that cast flickering blue light over her face, making her look like a spectral queen in her own secret kingdom. She reached up and pulled the pins from her hair, letting the dark waves fall over her shoulders in a messy, defiant cascade that obliterated the last of her professional librarian persona. This was the first confession, a silent and visual surrender of the mask she wore for the university, and as she stepped into my space, the scent of her dark cherry perfume filled my lungs until I couldn't think of anything but the rhythmic, heavy thrumming of my own heart. She didn't say a word, but the way she looked at me, with a mixture of raw hunger and a terrifying, cold possession, told me that the loyalty I owed to her brother Leo was currently being traded for something far more volatile and destructive. I felt the rough texture of the stone wall against my back and the soft, intoxicating pressure of her body against mine, a collision of worlds that felt like a beautiful slow-motion catastrophe. The silence of the vault was a physical weight, a thick and suffocating veil that made every shallow breath feel like a roar in the quiet, but that peace was shattered by the sudden, violent vibration of my phone in my pocket. The blue light of the screen cut through the darkness, flashing Leo's name with a persistent, demanding rhythm that made my blood run cold. He wasn't just calling, he was leaving a message, and in the absolute stillness of the vault, his voice echoed faintly from the speaker, sounding confused and worried. "Alex? I know you're in there. Henderson said he saw a light in the archives. I'm coming back with the keys, man. Don't pull an all-nighter and get locked in." The sound of my best friend's voice was the midpoint strike, a brutal intrusion of reality that brought the high stakes of our betrayal into sharp, clinical focus. I was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, my hand trembling as I reached for the phone, my conscience screaming at me to answer, to lie, to save the brotherhood that had defined my life. But as I moved to pull away, Olivia's hand clamped over mine, her fingers interlaced with mine in a bruisingly tight grip that forced me to stay. She didn't look afraid. She looked exhilarated by the proximity of our ruin, her thumb tracing the line of my pulse with a predatory, rhythmic intent that made the choice for me. I let the phone fall back into the shadows, the screen eventually going dark, a silent sacrifice of my integrity for the heat of her skin. We crossed the line in the deep shadows between the stacks of forbidden manuscripts, our bodies finding a desperate, jagged synchronization that ignored the cold stone and the weight of the history surrounding us. Every touch was an act of rebellion, a slow and deliberate unraveling of the boundaries that had kept me safe until this moment. I felt the friction of her silk blouse against my skin, the searing fire of her breath against my neck, and the intoxicating, rhythmic pressure of her hands as she explored the contours of my body with a hunger that was both terrifying and addictive. This wasn't just a physical encounter. It was an initiation into a secret world where the rules of the library were replaced by the raw, unpolished energy of our shared desire. The iron key she had used to lock the gate sat on a nearby pedestal, its meaning having shifted in my mind from a simple tool of her trade to a sacred symbol of our pact. It was no longer just a key. It was the physical proof of our recognition, a badge of the secret world we now inhabited. We were lost in the heat and the darkness, the world beyond the iron bars becoming a fading memory, until the sudden, metallic clank of the main archive doors swinging open made our hearts stop in unison. Leo was in the archives now, his voice much clearer, bouncing off the marble floors, just a few dozen yards away from our fortress. "Olivia? Alex? If this is a prank, it's not funny." The sound of his footsteps, heavy and rhythmic, was a terrifyingly real threat that forced us to pull apart, our breaths ragged and shallow as we fought to regain some semblance of control. The risk of exposure was a physical pressure, a suffocating weight that turned the vault into a cage of our own making. Olivia smoothed her hair with a practiced, clinical speed that left me reeling, her face returning to its mask of cold, professional indifference in a heartbeat. She grabbed the iron key from the pedestal, the cool metal biting into her palm, and pressed it into my hand, her eyes blazing with a defiant, terminal resolve. "He can't get into the vault without the master override from the security office," she hissed, her voice a low, melodic vibration that promised both salvation and a long, dark descent. "But we can't stay here tonight. The sensors will pick up the heat signatures if we stay too long." She leaned in for one last, bruising kiss that tasted of dark cherries and victory before pushing me toward a small, hidden service door at the back of the vault. "Tomorrow, 2 in the morning, the old bell tower in the North Quad. If you still want to hear the silence break, you'll be there." She slipped out through the iron gate, leaving me alone in the shadows with a key that felt like a live wire, and the terrifying knowledge that our next meeting would be the one that either saved us or burned us both to the ground. The North Quad bell tower stood like a jagged obsidian tooth against the moonless sky, its ancient stone walls vibrating with the low, mournful whistle of the midnight wind that seemed to carry the whispered warnings of every bridge I had burned to get here. It was exactly 2 in the morning, the hour when the university felt less like an institution of learning and more like a graveyard of abandoned secrets, and as I climbed the final, crumbling spiral of the iron staircase, the heavy key from the vault felt like a piece of cold shrapnel in my pocket. The air at this height was thin and biting, smelling of damp stone, ozone, and the faint, haunting trail of dark cherry perfume that told me Olivia was already waiting in the shadows of the massive bronze bell. I reached the top platform, my lungs burning and my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and found her standing at the edge of the parapet, her silhouette framed by the distant, flickering lights of a city that looked like a fallen galaxy. She wasn't wearing the librarian's blazer or the severe bun tonight. Her hair was a wild, dark storm around her shoulders, and she wore a trench coat that seemed to swallow the light around her. She didn't turn when I approached, but the tension in the air was so thick it felt like a physical barrier, a rhythmic pressure that turned the freezing height into a furnace of unsaid words and forbidden intent. The silence of the tower was a fragile glass dome, and it shattered with the violent, metallic groan of the heavy oak door at the base of the tower swinging open. I froze, my blood turning to ice as the rhythmic, unmistakable thud of Henderson's security boots began to echo up the spiral stairs, accompanied by the distorted, static-heavy chatter of his radio. This was the midpoint strike, a moment of near-total exposure that stripped away the illusion of our safety and left us exposed on a stone altar. The flashlight beam began to dance across the underside of the platform, a frantic, searching eye that was climbing closer with every heartbeat. I looked at the drop, a 40-foot fall into the dark, and then at the narrow, shadowed space behind the massive bronze bell, realization dawning that there was nowhere to run. In that split second, the choice was laid bare before me, a jagged blade of a decision that came with a terminal price. I could surrender, face the immediate expulsion and the permanent loss of Leo's friendship, or I could double down on this madness and step into the abyss with her. I chose the abyss. I grabbed Olivia's hand, her skin scorching even in the freezing wind, and pulled her into the suffocatingly tight crevice behind the bell, our bodies locking together in a desperate, silent synchronization as the light reached the top floor. We were pressed so tightly together that I could feel the frantic, rhythmic gallop of her heart against my own, her breath hot and shallow against my neck as we listened to Henderson reach the platform. The guard's breathing was heavy, his flashlight sweeping inches from our faces, the light reflecting off the bronze bell in a way that made the dark space feel like a hall of mirrors. In this moment of absolute risk, the physical proximity was no longer just a consequence of hiding, it was a confession. Olivia looked into my eyes, her gaze raw and stripped of every professional mask she had ever worn, her hand reaching up to grip the front of my shirt with a bruising, desperate intensity. "Don't breathe," she whispered, the words less a command and more of an intimate hint, a shared pact of survival that transformed the terror of being caught into a jagged, adrenaline-fueled high. The guard lingered for what felt like an eternity, his radio hissing like a serpent, before he finally grunted and began the long descent back to the ground. The relief was a tidal wave, but it didn't bring peace. It brought a total collapse of the boundaries we had tried to maintain. We were alone at the top of the world, survivors of a near disaster, and the heat that exploded between us was a visceral, rhythmic rebellion against the cold stone and the rules of the world below. As the echoes of Henderson's footsteps finally vanished, the atmosphere in the tower shifted from a hiding place to a sanctuary of recognition. I pulled back just enough to look at her, my hand brushing against the pocket where her library ID had been tucked away. I pulled it out, the plastic glistening in the faint moonlight, and for the first time, the symbol changed its meaning entirely. Earlier, it had been a badge of her authority, a mark of the librarian who kept the peace. Now, it was the key to a betrayal I was only beginning to understand. I looked at the name printed on the card, not Olivia, but Victoria Harrison, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just Leo's sister. She was the ghost in his family's house, the woman his father had married in secret, a revelation that turned our intimacy into a weapon that could destroy a dynasty. "You knew I'd find out," I whispered, my voice a low vibration in the wind. She didn't deny it. She simply took the card from my hand, her fingers lingering against mine in a gesture that was both a confession and a challenge. "Olivia was the mask, Alex. Victoria is the reality. And now that you've seen her, you can never go back to being just a student." The night ended with a final, irrevocable ticket to the next part of our shared destruction. Victoria reached into her coat and produced a small, elegant envelope, pressing it into my hand as she stepped back toward the stairs, her silhouette once again becoming a sharp, unreachable shadow. "My husband, Leo's father, is hosting a formal dinner tomorrow night to properly introduce me to the family circle," she said, her voice dropping to a husky, melodic register that made my blood run cold. "You're invited, Alex. Leo insisted on it. He wants his best friend there to meet his new stepmother." She flashed a smile that was both beautiful and terrifying before vanishing into the dark of the stairwell, leaving me alone at the top of the tower with an invitation that felt like a death warrant. I stood there, clutching the envelope as the first light of dawn began to bleed across the horizon, knowing that tomorrow I wouldn't just be breaking a rule, I would be walking into the heart of a fire that would leave nothing but ash. The Harrison estate was a monument to cold, inherited wealth, its marble halls echoing with the polished lies of a family I was systematically destroying from the inside out. Arriving at the formal dinner felt like walking into a velvet-lined trap, the air thick with the scent of lilies, expensive cigar smoke, and the underlying, acidic stench of my own growing guilt. Leo met me at the door, his arm around my shoulder in a gesture of brotherhood that made me want to vanish into the floorboards. He was smiling, genuinely happy to have his best friend there to witness his father's new beginning. To be here, I had already sacrificed everything that defined the man I used to be. I had lied to my parents, claiming I was at an emergency study session, and I had performed the ultimate act of self-sabotage by powering off my phone and missing the final review for my bar exam, the very thing that was supposed to be my ticket out of this town. I was throwing away my future for a woman who was currently playing the role of the perfect, modest bride in a room full of sharks. As I stepped into the grand dining hall, I felt the heavy weight of the tower invitation in my pocket, a slip of paper that had transformed from a simple ticket into a badge of mutual destruction, a symbol that we no longer just shared a secret, but a shared terminal trajectory. The atmosphere at the table was a suffocating display of psychological pressure, a clinical performance of domestic bliss that was rotting at the seams. Victoria, or Olivia, as I still wanted to call her in my mind, sat at the head of the table next to Leo's father, a man whose eyes were as sharp and unforgiving as broken glass. She was wearing a high-necked, conservative silk dress that should have made her look untouchable, but to me, it was just a thin veil over the raw, electric heat of the woman who had pinned me against the library stacks. Every time she glanced my way, it was a visceral, rhythmic assault on my senses, her eyes conveying a silent, intimate hint of the fire we had ignited in the vault. The midpoint strike came when Leo's father cleared his throat, his gaze settling on me with a terrifying, predatory stillness. "Henderson mentioned a disturbance at the library last night," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that made the silverware on the table seem to hum. "He said he saw two figures in the tower. He couldn't identify them, but he found a library card near the stairs." My heart stopped, a cold jolt of adrenaline seizing my lungs as I realized the symbol had been found. Victoria didn't flinch, but beneath the table, I felt the sharp, unmistakable pressure of her heel against my foot, a gesture of absolute recognition and a warning that the floor was about to give way. The dinner felt like an endless interrogation, and the external danger became a physical reality when Leo's father's personal assistant leaned in to whisper something in his ear, his eyes darting toward me with a localized, piercing suspicion. Someone had seen more than Henderson was letting on, and the walls of the mansion were starting to feel like they were closing in. After the meal, Victoria managed to corner me in the dimly lit library of the estate, a room that felt like a mockery of the sanctuary where we had first met. For the first time, the mask of the stepmother fell away completely, and she opened up with a raw, haunting vulnerability that made the breath catch in my throat. "I'm not a trophy, Alex, and I'm not a villain," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of a decade of loneliness. "This marriage was a business deal I made to save my family from bankruptcy, a divorce I've been craving since the day I said I do. I took the job at the library just to have a world where I wasn't just a signature on a bank account. I'm tired of being a ghost, Alex. I chose you because you're the only thing in my life that isn't a lie." It was the first time I saw the woman behind the predator, a soul as trapped and desperate as my own, and the recognition between us was a physical ache that obliterated my remaining defenses. Despite the shadow of Leo's father, and the growing certainty that we were being watched, the magnetic pull between us was a gravity we could no longer escape. We were standing in the heart of the enemy's territory, surrounded by the ghosts of a dynasty, but as she reached out to trace the line of my jaw, the world outside that library vanished into a blur of amber light and dark cherry perfume. We had crossed the line so many times that the line no longer existed. We were simply two drowning people clutching at one another in a sea of broken promises. The price of our next meeting was the total destruction of our social standing, a social suicide that would leave us with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the secrets in our heads. But as she leaned in, her lips ghosting over mine for a fraction of a second, I knew that I would burn the entire city down just to hear her whisper my name in the dark one more time. The risk was no longer a deterrent. It was the only thing that made me feel alive. The night ended with a final, irrevocable pact made in the shadows of the hallway as the guests began to depart. Victoria slipped a small, cold object into my hand, a brass key to the private garden gate at the rear of the estate. "Midnight tomorrow," she hissed, her eyes blazing with a defiant, terminal resolve that told me she was ready to end the charade once and for all. "The gate leads to the old carriage house. If Marcus or Leo's father is watching, let them see. I'm done hiding." She vanished back into the grand hall before I could respond, leaving me with a key that felt like a ticket to my own execution. I walked out into the cool night air, the silence of the estate a heavy, expectant veil, knowing that our next meeting wouldn't just be a secret encounter, it would be the collision that finally brought the whole world crashing down around us. I stood by my car, clutching the key until it bit into my palm, a silent recognition that tomorrow, the quiet would finally be broken forever. The old carriage house at the edge of the Harrison estate felt like a forgotten relic of a different century, its air thick with the smell of damp hay, aged timber, and the sharp, metallic tang of the storm that was currently tearing across the coast. It was exactly midnight, the hour where the lines between loyalty and betrayal had blurred into a single, jagged path that led me straight to the heavy wooden door. I stood there, clutching the brass key Victoria had given me, my knuckles white, and my heart performing a frantic, rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs that seemed to echo the thunder rolling in the distance. The atmosphere was suffocating, a volatile mix of the freezing night air and the electric, invisible heat I knew was waiting for me on the other side. By coming here, I had effectively signed the death warrant of my friendship with Leo and my own future in this town. I was a man who had chosen a shadow over the sun, a secret over the truth. When I finally turned the key, the groan of the hinges sounded like a final, irrevocable sentence, and as I stepped into the dim, amber light of the interior, I saw Victoria standing near a stack of antique saddles, her hair a dark, wild storm around her shoulders, her eyes burning with a terminal resolve that told me there was no longer any world left for us but this one. The silence of the carriage house was a fragile, expectant veil, and it was violently torn apart by the sudden, sweeping glare of a flashlight through the high, dust-caked windows, the midpoint strike of our final exposure. I heard the crunch of gravel outside, and the muffled, frantic voice of Leo calling my name, his tone a mixture of confusion and a growing, horrifying realization. He had found the garden gate open. He had followed the breadcrumbs of my lies straight to the altar of my betrayal. "Alex, I know you're in there. My father's guard found the card. Just tell me it wasn't you." The sound of my best friend's voice was a physical blow, a cold jolt of reality that stripped away the romantic madness of the night and left me exposed as a traitor. I looked at the back exit, a narrow door that led to the cliffs in safety, and then I looked at Victoria, who hadn't moved a muscle, her gaze locked onto mine with a silent, daring challenge. This was the choice of the hero with a price. I could run and preserve the lie, perhaps saving a shred of my dignity, or I could stay and let the world see exactly who I had become. I chose the fire. I reached out and grabbed Victoria's hand, my fingers interlacing with hers in a bruising, desperate grip that was my final confession. "I'm not leaving," I whispered, the words a low, melodic vibration that signaled my total surrender to the dark. The climax was a short, concrete, and devastating collision of our realities as Leo's hand hit the door, but the lock held, leaving us suspended in a moment of absolute, rhythmic intensity. In that narrow pocket of time, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the heat of her skin, the scent of dark cherries and rain, and the visceral, crushing weight of our shared rebellion. We didn't hide. We leaned into the danger, our bodies finding a desperate, frantic synchronization that was the ultimate breaking of every rule I had ever known. It was a symphony of suppressed gasps and the distant roar of the ocean, a final act of defiance against the family, the school, and the brotherhood I had incinerated. The brass key, which had been a ticket to a secret meeting, now lay on the floorboards, its meaning having shifted from a symbol of secrecy to one of recognition, a badge of the life we had chosen to live in the shadows. When Leo's footsteps eventually retreated, not because he was satisfied, but because the silence from within was more damning than any confession, I knew the break was permanent. We had chosen the shadow life, a terminal pact that meant we would be together, but we would be ghosts to everyone else. A month later, the university felt like a landscape of ash and memories I no longer owned. I had been expelled, my legal career a ghost of a dream, but the reward for my path was a clandestine existence that felt more real than any diploma. Every Tuesday night, at exactly 2 in the morning, the new ritual began. I would walk to the old, boarded-up entrance of the rare archives, a place that was now officially off-limits to everyone but the maintenance crews. I would find a single, white library card tucked into the crack of the door, a new note written in that sharp, elegant script that made my blood boil with a familiar, addictive heat. We had perfected the art of the hidden world. The university thought she had moved to Europe after the divorce, and the Harrisons thought I had vanished into the city, but the truth was much closer to home. We were the masters of the quiet, living in the spaces between the lines of the world's perception, our intimacy a secret fire that burned brighter because it was never meant to be seen. I reached the archives tonight, the winter air biting and sharp, and saw the familiar sliver of paper waiting for me. I didn't need to read it to know what it said. The recognition was in the air, in the scent of lavender and old paper that always seemed to linger near the entrance when she was close. I placed my hand against the cold, heavy oak of the door, feeling the faint, rhythmic vibration of someone moving on the other side. This was my life now, a ticket to a never-ending midnight, a shared exile that I wouldn't trade for 1,000 suns. I pulled the small brass key from my pocket, the one from the carriage house that I had kept as a relic of the night I died and was reborn. As I inserted it into the lock, the world of Leo, my parents, and my past vanished into the dark, leaving only the woman waiting for me in the silence. I pushed the door open, stepping into the amber glow of the foyer, and the last thing I felt before the darkness swallowed me was a single, warm hand pulling me into the shadows.